Some people wait for a flight to change their life, others miss it and find something better. The announcement echoed through Terminal B, sharp and indifferent, final boarding call for Flight 247 to New York. The words cut through the polished air of the private lounge, where leather chairs gleamed under soft golden lighting and businessmen tapped impatiently on their phones, but Adrian Cole didn't move. At 38, he had mastered the art of precision, every minute scheduled, every decision calculated, every outcome controlled, but now, for the first time in years, something small and unexpected had interrupted the rhythm of his world. It wasn't the call of his assistant reminding him that the jet was waiting, engines already humming on the runway, nor was it the vibration of his phone flashing another seven-figure deal awaiting approval. It was a voice. Soft. Steady. Out of place. Just beyond the glass wall of the lounge, tucked into a quiet corner near a row of vending machines, a young woman sat cross-legged on the cold tile floor, a worn paperback book in her hands. Around her, 5 children huddled close, their oversized jackets mismatched, their shoes scuffed from miles no child should have to walk. And yet, they were smiling. Really smiling. The kind that reached their eyes. Adrian's gaze lingered longer than he intended, drawn not by spectacle but by contrast. The fluorescent lights above them flickered faintly, casting uneven shadows, but her voice seemed to warm the space in a way no design ever could. She turned a page carefully, as if the book itself were something precious, her fingers trembling just slightly before she steadied them and continued reading. And even when the storm felt endless, she said gently, the little boat kept moving. Because hope doesn't need calm waters to survive. One of the children, a boy no older than 6, leaned closer, his head resting against her arm as if the words themselves were something he could hold on to. Adrian felt something tighten in his chest, subtle but undeniable. He had heard thousands of voices in boardrooms, negotiations, press conferences, all sharpened by ambition or softened by strategy, but this voice carried no agenda. No expectation. Just presence. Sir? His assistant's voice cut in again, low but urgent through the earpiece. They're about to close the gate. Adrian glanced briefly toward the departure board, the bright letters confirming what he already knew. This flight mattered. The meeting waiting on the other side could shift an entire quarter, influence markets, reinforce his position at the top. It was the kind of moment his entire life had been built around. And yet, his feet remained still. Behind the glass, the woman smiled at the children, her exhaustion visible now in the faint shadows beneath her eyes, in the way she adjusted her coat as if trying to keep the cold out without interrupting the story. She didn't look up. She didn't notice the world passing her by. She didn't notice him. And somehow, that made it impossible for him to look away. The announcement came again, louder this time, more insistent. Final call. Adrian exhaled slowly, his grip tightening briefly around the sleek boarding pass in his hand. Then, without fully understanding why, he turned his back on the gate, and kept watching her instead. Adrian lowered his hand slowly, the boarding pass still between his fingers, but now it felt lighter, almost irrelevant, as if it belonged to a different version of himself, one that would have already been halfway down the jet bridge by now, answering emails and reviewing contracts without a second thought, yet here he stood, unmoving, while the world around him continued at full speed, passengers rushing past with rolling suitcases, announcements echoing across the terminal, screens flashing. Departures and delays, all of it blending into a distant hum compared to the quiet gravity of that small circle on the floor, where Lily Brooks turned another page with care, her voice steady despite the fatigue that clung to her shoulders, and for a moment Adrian noticed something he had missed before, a small backpack beside her. Faded blue with a broken zipper, resting just within reach, and when one of the children shifted closer, she instinctively placed her hand protectively over it, not possessive, but careful, as if everything she owned had to stay within arm's length, a habit built from experience, not choice, and the realization settled in his chest with a weight he could not quite name, because nothing about this scene made sense in his world. People like her were supposed to be statistics, distant, abstract. Reduced to numbers in reports about housing or social programs, not someone sitting 10 yards away, reading a story like it was the most important job in the world, not someone whose voice could make a group of children forget, even for a few minutes, where they would be sleeping that night, and yet that was exactly what she was doing. Without hesitation, without an audience, without expecting anything in return, and Adrian felt a quiet shift inside him, subtle but undeniable, like something long buried had been brushed awake. "Sir, we have held the gate as long as we can," his assistant's voice came again, more urgent now. "If you do not board in the next 60 seconds, the flight will depart without you." Adrian glanced down at the sleek black watch on his wrist, the second hand moving forward with relentless precision. Measuring out a life he had always followed without question, each tick a decision made, a deal closed, a step further into a world that rewarded control and efficiency above all else, and yet now, those seconds felt strangely disconnected from what mattered, because just beyond the glass, Lily's voice softened as she reached the end of the story. Her tone gentle, almost like a promise, and even when no one was watching, the little boat kept going, because it knew someone out there still needed it to try. One of the younger girls blinked up at her, wide-eyed. "Like you?" she asked quietly, and Lily smiled, not embarrassed, not proud, just warm. "Like all of us," she replied, her voice carrying a quiet certainty that seemed to steady the air around them. And something in that moment broke through the last layer of hesitation Adrian had been holding on to, because no negotiation, no contract, no carefully planned decision had ever felt this immediate, this real. And before his mind could calculate the consequences, his hand moved, the boarding pass slipping free from his fingers and falling silently into the nearest trash bin. The motion simple, almost insignificant, yet it echoed louder in his chest than any announcement ever could. "Cancel the flight," he said calmly into his earpiece, his voice steady in a way that surprised even him. There was a pause on the other end, confusion, disbelief. Then, "Sir?" Adrian did not repeat himself. He just turned away from the gate completely this time, each step carrying him closer to the quiet corner he had been watching, closer to the woman who had no idea that, in less than 10 minutes, she had already changed the course of his day, and perhaps something far more permanent than that. Adrian slowed his pace as he approached, the polished soles of his shoes making almost no sound against the tile, yet every step felt unusually deliberate, as if he were entering a space that did not belong to his world. And in many ways it did not, because here there were no tailored suits leaning over conference tables, no assistants waiting for instructions, no urgency wrapped in numbers and deadlines, just a quiet circle of children and a woman who had chosen to sit with them instead of anywhere else she could have been. And for a brief moment he hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of something far less familiar, respect, because whatever this was, it felt fragile, like a moment that could disappear if handled too carelessly. So he stopped just a few feet away, close enough to hear the soft rustle of the pages as Lily closed the book gently and rested it on her lap, the children shifting around her, some leaning into her side, others stretching their legs as if reluctant for the moment to end. "Is that it?" one of the boys asked, his voice carrying a quiet disappointment, and Lily smiled, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "For today," she said softly, "but stories do not really end, they just wait for the next time." The girl beside her frowned slightly. "What if there is no next time?" Lily paused, not caught off guard, but thoughtful, as if she had been asked this before. "Then we remember the part that mattered," she answered, her voice calm but certain, "because that part stays with you longer than anything else." Adrian felt that answer settle somewhere deeper than he expected, not as something to analyze, but something to feel, and before he could reconsider, he stepped forward. The movement subtle but enough to draw Lily's attention for the first time, her eyes lifting to meet his, steady and observant, not surprised, not intimidated, just aware, and for a second neither of them spoke, the noise of the terminal filling the space between them, until one of the children noticed him and nudged another, their curiosity immediate. "Are you going somewhere?" the smallest girl asked, looking up at him with open interest. Adrian glanced down at her, then back at Lily, and something about the simplicity of the question made him answer without thinking. "I was," he said quietly, the past tense surprising even him. Lily studied him for a brief moment longer, her gaze not searching for status or intention, just understanding. Then she nodded slightly, as if accepting that answer without needing more. "Well," she said gently, shifting the book aside and adjusting the strap of her worn backpack, "you made it in time for the ending, There was no hint of sarcasm in her tone, only a quiet acknowledgement, and Adrian found himself almost smiling, a rare expression that softened the edges of his usually composed demeanor. "It seems like I did," he replied, his voice lower now, less guarded. One of the boys tilted his head, eyeing Adrian's watch, the polished metal catching the overhead light. "That looks expensive," he said bluntly, and Lily gave him a quick look, not scolding, just reminding, but Adrian shook his head slightly, dismissing the comment without offense. "It just tells time," he answered simply, and for the first time in years, he meant it, because standing there, the value of seconds felt entirely different than it had 10 minutes ago. Lily watched that exchange carefully, something thoughtful passing through her expression, as if she was measuring not what he had, but how he carried it, and then she rose slowly to her feet, brushing dust from her jeans with a small, practiced motion, the children following her lead, gathering their things with quiet efficiency that spoke of routine rather than chaos. "We should head out," she said softly to them, her tone shifting from storyteller to protector in an instant, and Adrian noticed how naturally they listened, how they stayed close to her without being told twice, how she moved just slightly ahead but always within reach, and something about that quiet leadership, that steady presence, held more weight than any authority he had ever commanded. And as she turned back briefly, her eyes meeting his once more, there was no expectation in them, no request, just a simple acknowledgement that he had been there, that he had seen something real, and for reasons he could not fully explain yet, Adrian knew he was not ready to walk away from it. Lily adjusted the strap of her backpack as the children gathered around her, their small voices overlapping with quiet questions about where they were going next, and she answered each one with calm patience, her tone steady even as she kept a careful eye on the flow of people moving through the terminal, making sure none of the children drifted too far from her reach. And Adrian found himself following a few steps behind without fully deciding to, his presence unannounced but no longer distant, because something about the way she moved, attentive but unassuming, made it impossible for him to return to the version of the day he had left behind. "We have about half a mile to the shelter," she said gently to the group, her voice low but clear, "so we stay together, okay?" The children nodded, some slipping their hands into the pockets of oversized jackets, others instinctively walking closer to her side, and Adrian noticed how naturally they trusted her, how their pace matched hers without hesitation, as if she had become their center without ever asking to be, and when she turned slightly, catching him still there, her expression did not change, but there was a quiet question in her eyes, not challenging, just acknowledging that he had chosen to remain. "You do not have to follow us," she said simply, her voice carrying no defensiveness, just clarity, and Adrian paused for a moment, considering how easily he could step away now, return to a car waiting outside, reschedule the flight, reclaim the structure of a life built on predictability. But instead he glanced toward the glass doors leading out into the evening air, then back at her. "I know," he replied calmly, and there was something in the way he said it that made it clear he understood exactly what he was choosing. Lily studied him for a second longer, as if deciding whether to say more, but then she gave a small nod and turned back to the children, continuing forward without another word. And somehow that quiet acceptance felt more significant than any invitation could have been. The doors slid open with a soft mechanical sound, letting in a rush of cooler air that carried the faint scent of rain and city pavement, and as they stepped outside, the contrast between the controlled brightness of the terminal and the dimming light of early evening became immediate. The sky stretched in muted shades of gray and blue, streetlights beginning to flicker on one by one, casting long reflections across the damp sidewalk. And Lily tightened her grip on the smallest girl's hand, adjusting her pace to match the slowest among them, while Adrian followed at a respectful distance, noticing details he would have overlooked any other day, the uneven rhythm of footsteps, the quiet resilience in the way the children moved, the absence of complaint despite the distance ahead, and after a few minutes, one of the boys glanced back at him again, curiosity returning. "Are you coming with us?" he asked, more certain this time, and Adrian met his gaze, then looked briefly at Lily before answering. "If that is okay," he said, not to the child, but to her, and Lily slowed just slightly, enough to let her words reach him without breaking the group's movement. "It is a public sidewalk," she replied, her tone neutral but not unkind, and then after a small pause, she added, softer this time, "but they do not need promises." The sentence settled between them with quiet weight, not an accusation, not a warning, just truth, and Adrian felt it land more clearly than any negotiation ever had, because in his world promises were currency, exchanged, leveraged, often forgotten once the outcome was secured, but here, in this moment, he understood that what she meant was simpler and far more demanding: presence without expectation, action without conditions. And as they continued walking under the glow of the streetlights, Adrian realized that whatever had brought him to this point was no longer just curiosity, it was something deeper, something that did not fit into the language of deals or decisions, something that required him to stay, not because he had to, but because for the first time in a long time, leaving would feel like losing something he had not even known he needed. The rhythm of their footsteps settled into something almost steady as they moved deeper into the city, the distant noise of traffic blending with the soft shuffle of worn sneakers against damp pavement, and Adrian found himself adjusting his pace without thinking, matching the group instead of leading it, something he had not done in years, if ever, because his life had always been about moving ahead, setting direction, expecting others to follow, yet here, walking just a few steps behind Lily and the children, he felt an unfamiliar sense of ease in simply being part of something rather than controlling it. And as they passed beneath a flickering streetlight, one of the boys tugged gently at Lily's sleeve, his voice low but hopeful. "Are we going to have dinner tonight?" The question was quiet, almost careful, as if he had learned not to expect too much, and Lily glanced down at him with a softness that did not promise more than she could give, but did not take away hope either. "We will figure something out," she said gently, her words measured, honest, and Adrian noticed the way she did not rush to reassure him with certainty, how she chose truth over comfort, and something about that restraint felt more powerful than any guarantee, because it carried trust instead of illusion. And without fully thinking it through, Adrian reached into his coat pocket, his fingers brushing against his wallet, the familiar weight of it suddenly feeling heavier than usual. But before he could act on the instinct, Lily's earlier words echoed quietly in his mind: "They do not need promises," and he hesitated. Not out of doubt, but out of recognition that whatever he did next could not come from habit, it had to come from understanding, so instead he stepped forward just slightly, enough to walk beside her rather than behind, and spoke in a tone that was quieter than his usual confidence: "Is there a place nearby that serves food?" Lily glanced at him briefly, her expression thoughtful but unreadable, as if weighing not the question itself, but the intention behind it. "There is a small diner about 3 blocks from this shelter," she replied after a moment, her voice even. "They close early, though." Adrian nodded, absorbing the detail, then looked ahead toward the dim outline of the street, calculating distance without realizing he was doing it, and for once, the calculation did not involve profit or timing, just possibility. One of the children looked up at him again, curiosity still present. "Do you eat there too?" the boy asked, and Adrian allowed a faint smile to touch his expression, something rare and unguarded. "Not yet," he said simply, and the honesty of that answer seemed to settle easily among them, as if it belonged there. And as they continued walking, the city around them shifted subtly, the polished storefronts giving way to older buildings, the sidewalks less crowded, the light softer and more uneven, and Lily adjusted her grip on the smallest girl's hand again, guiding her carefully over a cracked section of pavement, her attention constant, her presence steady in a way that required no announcement, and Adrian noticed how naturally she anticipated each small need, how she moved before being asked, how she stayed aware of everything without appearing overwhelmed, and it struck him then, quietly but clearly, that what she was doing was not temporary, not accidental. It was something she had chosen again and again, day after day, without recognition, without reward, and the realization shifted something deeper inside him, because for the first time, helping did not feel like a transaction waiting to happen. It felt like something that required patience, something that could not be rushed or solved in a single moment. And as the faint glow of a diner sign came into view at the end of the block, casting a warm amber light onto the sidewalk, Adrian understood that this night was no longer about what he could offer, it was about what he was willing to learn by staying. The warm glow of the diner sign flickered softly above them as they approached, its amber light spilling onto the sidewalk like a quiet invitation, and for a moment the children slowed, their eyes lifting toward the windows where silhouettes of people sat inside, plates in front of them, steam rising in soft curls, and the simple sight of it carried a kind of gravity that made even the smallest among them fall silent. Because hunger had a way of making ordinary things feel distant, almost unreachable, and Lily noticed that shift immediately, her pace easing as she gently guided them closer. "Stay together," she reminded softly, her voice calm but firm, and as they reached the door, she paused just long enough to open it and let the children step in first, her hand steady against the cool metal handle. The bell above the entrance chiming faintly as they entered, and the warmth inside wrapped around them instantly, a contrast so immediate it made Adrian pause for half a second, taking in the change, the scent of coffee and grilled food, the low hum of conversation, the steady clatter of dishes behind the counter, all of it grounded and real in a way that felt unfamiliar to him, and yet strangely welcome. The children hesitated just inside, their eyes moving from booth to booth, unsure where they belonged, until Lily stepped forward, guiding them toward a corner table, one large enough to fit them all, her movements quiet but assured, as if she had done this many times before, and Adrian followed without hesitation now, sliding into the seat across from them, his presence drawing a few curious glances from other customers. Not because of who he was, but because of the contrast he represented, the tailored coat, the polished shoes, the calm composure that did not quite match the worn edges of the group he had joined. But Lily did not acknowledge that contrast. She simply reached for a stack of menus and began handing them out to the children, her voice soft as she explained, "Pick something simple, okay?" And they nodded, though it was clear most of them were choosing based on what they hoped they were allowed to have rather than what they truly wanted, and Adrian watched this quietly, noticing the small hesitations, the way one of the girls traced her finger over the cheapest item on the page, the way another boy glanced at Lily before settling on something modest, as if asking permission without speaking, and something in that silent exchange settled firmly in Adrian's chest, sharper now, clearer than before, because this was no longer an abstract understanding, it was immediate, present, and before the waitress could even reach their table, Adrian spoke, his tone calm but certain. "They can order whatever they want," he said, not loudly, not as a declaration, but as a simple fact. And Lily's gaze lifted to meet his again. Her expression still composed, but this time there was a flicker of something else there, something that measured not the offer itself, but the way it was given, and she held his gaze for a moment, just long enough to make sure he understood the weight of what he was stepping into, before she turned back to the children. "You heard him," she said gently, her voice steady, "choose what you would like," and the shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable, the children's shoulders relaxing, their voices gaining a hint of excitement, cautious but real, and Adrian felt something inside him respond to that change, not as satisfaction, not as accomplishment, but as a quiet confirmation that he had taken the right step, even if he was only beginning to understand what that meant. And as the waitress approached, pen in hand, ready to take their order, Adrian realized that this night was unfolding in a way no plan could have predicted, and for the first time in a long time, he did not try to control where it would lead next. The waitress moved quickly but not rushed, her notepad ready as she glanced around the table, her expression softening just slightly as she took in the group, the children sitting a little straighter now, their eyes moving between the menu and Lily as if still unsure how much freedom they truly had, and when she looked at Adrian, there was a brief flicker of recognition, not of who he was, but of what he represented in that moment, someone who did not quite belong and yet had chosen to stay. "What can I get for you all?" she asked, her tone warm but professional, and for a second no one spoke, until Lily nodded gently toward the children, encouraging them without pressure. "Go ahead," she said softly, and one by one they began to order, their voices quiet at first, careful, as if they expected to be corrected, but when no one interrupted, when Adrian simply listened and the waitress wrote each item down without hesitation, something shifted again, the hesitation easing into something closer to trust, and Adrian noticed how even the smallest choices carried weight, how deciding between pancakes or eggs was not just about preference but about permission, and he found himself paying attention to each order as if it mattered, because here, it did. When the waitress turned to him last, he glanced at the menu briefly, then closed it without looking too long. "Just coffee," he said simply, and she nodded before collecting the menus and stepping away, leaving behind a quiet that was no longer uncomfortable, but filled with something softer. The children began to talk among themselves, small bursts of excitement slipping through as they compared what they had ordered, their voices low but brighter now, and Lily watched them with a quiet sense of ease, her shoulders relaxing just slightly for the first time since they had entered, and Adrian noticed that too, the way her posture shifted when the children felt safe, the way she allowed herself to breathe a little deeper when they were not worrying, and it struck him again that everything she did was connected to them, every choice, every movement, every moment measured not by her own needs but by theirs, and after a few seconds, she reached into her backpack, pulling out a small folded stack of papers and a pen, handing them out to the children. "You can draw while we wait," she said gently, and they accepted them with quiet enthusiasm, immediately bending over the pages, their focus shifting with surprising ease, and Adrian watched as one of the boys began sketching uneven lines that slowly formed into something recognizable. A small house with a door and 2 windows, simple but intentional, and something about that image stayed with him longer than expected, because it was not just a drawing, it was a reflection of something they did not have but still imagined, and without realizing it, Adrian leaned back slightly, his gaze moving from the children to Lily, who had not taken anything for herself, her hands resting loosely in her lap as she watched them. Present but not imposing, and after a moment, he spoke again, his voice quieter now, more thoughtful than before. "You do this every day?" Lily looked up, meeting his gaze without hesitation, and there was no pride in her expression, no need to justify or explain, just honesty. "As often as I can," she replied, her tone steady, and Adrian nodded slowly, absorbing that answer, because in his world consistency was measured in schedules and outcomes, but here, it was measured in presence, in showing up even when it was difficult, even when no one noticed. And as the food began to arrive, plates set down carefully one by one, the children's attention shifting immediately, their eyes lighting up in a way that was impossible to ignore, Adrian felt something settle more firmly inside him, not a conclusion, not a decision, but a growing understanding that this night was not an interruption to his life, it was revealing something his life had been missing all along. The plates arrived one after another, filling the small table with more food than the children were used to seeing at once, pancakes stacked high with syrup glistening under the warm lights, scrambled eggs still steaming, toast golden and soft, and for a moment no one moved, as if the reality of it needed time to settle in, until Lily gave a small nod, her voice gentle but certain, "Go ahead," and that was all it took, the hesitation breaking as the children reached forward, carefully at first, then with growing eagerness, their movements quick but not careless, as if they had learned to appreciate every bite without wasting a single one, and Adrian watched in silence, his coffee untouched in front of him, the dark surface reflecting the overhead light as he observed something he had never truly seen before, not hunger, but relief. The kind that softened shoulders, slowed breathing, allowed small smiles to return where tension had been. One of the boys looked up between bites, his expression open in a way that carried no pretense. "This is really good," he said simply, and Adrian nodded slightly, not because he had tasted it, but because he understood what the words meant beyond the food itself. Across the table Lily remained still, her hands resting lightly near the edge, her attention on the children rather than the plate in front of her that she had not yet touched, and Adrian noticed that too, the quiet way she waited, ensuring each of them had enough before allowing herself anything, and it was such a small detail, almost invisible, yet it carried more weight than anything she could have said, because it revealed something constant, something practiced. Something that came from choosing others first without making it a performance, and after a few moments, he spoke again, his voice low, careful not to interrupt the fragile comfort that had settled over the table. "You did not order anything for yourself." Lily glanced down briefly, then back at him, her expression calm, not defensive, not dismissive, just matter of fact. "I am not that hungry," she replied, and Adrian held her gaze for a second longer, not challenging the answer, but recognizing it for what it was, a familiar kind of sacrifice, one he had seen before in different forms, but never this quietly, never without acknowledgement, and without drawing attention to it. He reached for the edge of one of the plates, sliding it slightly toward her, not insisting, not making it an issue, just adjusting what was already there. And for a brief moment she hesitated, her eyes flickering between him and the children, as if weighing whether accepting that small shift would take something away from them. But when she saw that none of them were lacking, that the table held more than enough, she allowed herself to take a small piece, her movements unhurried, her gratitude unspoken but present, and Adrian leaned back again, not as someone who had provided, but as someone who was learning where to place his actions. The children continued eating, their voices rising and falling in soft conversation, bits of laughter weaving through the space, and the diner itself seemed to respond to that change, the noise around them blending into something warmer, less distant, and as Adrian watched one of the girls carefully fold her napkin, saving half of her toast for later, tucking it into the edge of her jacket with quiet precision, he felt something settle deeper inside him, something that did not come with clarity or conclusion, but with awareness, because this was not about a single meal, it was about understanding a reality he had never stepped into before, a world where small things carried lasting meaning, where presence mattered more than solutions, and as he lifted his coffee for the first time, the bitterness of it sharp but grounding, Adrian realized that the question was no longer why he had stayed, but what it would mean if he chose to keep staying even after this night was over. The conversation at the table softened as the food slowly disappeared, plates no longer full but not entirely empty either, the kind of balance that came from careful eating rather than abundance, and Adrian found himself noticing the details he would have overlooked before, the way one of the boys paused between bites to sip water slowly as if making the moment last, the way the smallest girl leaned slightly against Lily's arm without asking, her eyelids growing heavier with each passing minute, comfort settling in now that her hunger had eased, and Lily adjusted her position just enough to support her without interrupting the quiet rhythm of the group, her movements instinctive, practiced, and Adrian realized again that everything she did carried intention, even when it looked effortless. And as the last few bites were taken and the children began to slow, the energy at the table shifted from urgency to calm, their voices quieter now, their bodies less tense, and the diner around them continued its steady hum, waitresses moving between tables, coffee being refilled, the world carrying on as it always did, unaware that something small but meaningful had taken place in this corner booth. Adrian set his cup down gently, the ceramic clicking softly against the table, and for a moment he did not speak, because he understood now that silence could hold as much value as words, but then Lily looked up, her eyes meeting his again with that same steady awareness, and this time there was something different there, not distance, but recognition, as if she had begun to understand that he was not leaving immediately. That his presence was not temporary in the way most passing moments were. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice sincere but simple, not drawn out, not embellished, just enough to acknowledge what had been done without turning it into something larger than it needed to be, and Adrian nodded once, accepting the words without deflecting them, but also without allowing them to define the moment. "It was needed," he replied, and Lily studied that answer for a second, her expression thoughtful, as if weighing the meaning behind it, before giving a small nod of her own, understanding passing between them without the need for explanation. One of the boys glanced between them, then spoke with the straightforward curiosity only a child could carry, "Are you going to come back tomorrow?" The question hung in the air, simple but heavy with expectation, and Adrian felt it land differently than anything else had that evening, because it was not about the meal, not about what he had done, but about what came next, about whether this was a moment or a pattern, and he did not answer immediately, not because he did not want to, but because for the first time, he understood that the answer mattered in a way he could not take lightly. Lily's gaze shifted briefly to him, not intervening, not rescuing him from the question, just allowing the space for honesty to exist, and Adrian exhaled slowly, his eyes moving from the child back to her, then to the table, the empty plates, the folded napkins, the quiet signs of something completed but not finished, and when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but softer than before. "I do not know yet," he said truthfully, and there was no disappointment in Lily's expression, only acceptance, because she had never asked for certainty, only presence, and as the children began to gather their things again, slipping drawings back into their pockets, adjusting jackets, preparing to leave, Adrian realized that this moment was not about giving them an answer they wanted to hear. It was about understanding what kind of answer he was ready to live with, and as he stood with them, stepping back out into the cooling night air, the city lights reflecting faintly on the damp pavement, he knew that whatever came next would not be decided by obligation or impulse, but by something far quieter, something that had begun the moment he chose to stay, and had not yet reached its end. The bell above the diner door chimed softly again as they stepped back out into the night, the warmth they had just left behind fading quickly into the cool air that settled around them. and for a moment the children stood closer together, instinctively adjusting to the shift, their small hands pulling jackets tighter, their breaths visible in faint clouds under the streetlights, and Lily moved among them with quiet efficiency, making sure each one was ready before they continued, her attention steady, her presence grounding in a way that required no instruction, and Adrian remained just behind her, watching the transition with the same careful awareness that had been growing inside him all evening, because this part, the leaving, carried its own weight, the return to reality after a brief pause. The continuation of a life that did not change simply because of one warm meal, and as they began walking again, the sound of their footsteps echoed more clearly now against the quieter streets, the city settling into its nighttime rhythm, and after a few steps, Lily glanced slightly over her shoulder, not stopping, but acknowledging his continued presence. "The shelter is just around the next corner," she said, her voice calm, as if offering information rather than invitation, and Adrian nodded once, matching her pace without stepping ahead, and as they turned the corner, the building came into view, modest and worn, its exterior plain, the paint slightly faded, but a single light above the entrance cast a steady glow that made it stand out against the darker surroundings, and the children seemed to recognize it immediately. Their pace quickening just slightly, not rushing, but with a quiet sense of familiarity, and Lily allowed that small shift, guiding them forward with a gentle hand, and when they reached the door, she paused again, letting them go in first, her eyes scanning briefly, counting without speaking, ensuring no one was left behind, and Adrian watched that small routine unfold, the unspoken responsibility carried in each glance, and as the last child stepped inside, Lily turned back toward him for the first time since they had left the diner, the light from the entrance catching the edges of her face, softening the tired lines but not erasing them, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing immediate to say, the night itself holding enough meaning, but then she broke the silence gently. "This is where they stay," she said, not as an explanation, but as a simple truth, and Adrian looked past her into the building, catching glimpses of narrow hallways, simple furniture, a space that was safe but far from comfortable, and he felt the contrast settle more deeply now, because this was not a temporary stop, this was part of their daily reality, and when he looked back at Lily, there was no pity in his expression, only understanding, still forming but no longer distant. "And you?" he asked quietly, not assuming, not intruding, just asking, and Lily held his gaze for a second, her expression steady. "I come back in the morning," she replied, her answer clear without offering more than necessary, and Adrian nodded slowly, absorbing the meaning behind that, the consistency, the commitment that extended beyond moments like tonight, and after a brief pause, he reached into his coat pocket again, not with urgency this time, but with intention, pulling out a simple card, unmarked on the front, and he held it for a second before offering it to her, not pushing it forward, just making it available. "If there is anything they need," he said calmly, "you can reach me," and Lily looked at the card but did not take it immediately, her eyes lifting back to his, measuring the gesture with the same quiet discernment she had shown all evening, and then, slowly, she accepted it, her fingers brushing the edge lightly, not as acceptance of a solution, but as acknowledgement of a possibility, and as the door behind her remained open, the light spilling out onto the sidewalk, Adrian realized that this moment was not an ending, it was something far quieter, a beginning that would not announce itself, but would wait to be chosen again. The door to the shelter closed softly behind Lily, the faint click echoing in the quiet space between them, and for a moment Adrian remained where he stood, the dim streetlight casting long shadows across the pavement, the warmth from inside fading as the night settled in more fully, and he did not move right away, not because he was uncertain, but because something about the stillness felt necessary, as if leaving too quickly would break whatever had just taken shape, and through the narrow glass panel in the door he could see movement, the children dispersing inside, their small figures guided gently by the structure of the space, and Lily moving among them with the same calm presence she had carried all evening, her focus steady, her attention never divided. And it struck him again that her world did not pause when moments like this ended, it simply continued, shaped by responsibility rather than choice, and after a few seconds, the door opened again, just slightly, and Lily stepped back outside, pulling it closed behind her with care so as not to let the noise escape, and she stood there for a moment, the card still in her hand, her fingers resting lightly against its edge, not gripping it, not tucking it away, just holding it as if she had not yet decided what it meant, and Adrian met her gaze without speaking, allowing her the space to choose the next words, because he understood now that silence was not emptiness, it was respect, and after a brief pause, she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "Most people do not come this far," she said, not as an accusation, but as an observation. Something she had learned over time, and Adrian nodded once, accepting the truth of that without defense, because he knew she was not asking for justification, she was stating a fact, and he took a slow breath before responding, his tone measured, honest in a way that felt unfamiliar but necessary. "Most people do not stop at the beginning," he replied, and Lily considered that for a moment, her expression thoughtful, as if weighing whether his words were intention or instinct, and then she glanced briefly at the card again before slipping it into the outer pocket of her backpack, not hidden, not displayed, just placed where it could be reached if needed, and that simple action carried more meaning than any verbal agreement could have, because it was not acceptance, it was openness, and Adrian noticed it immediately. The quiet way she allowed the possibility without surrendering control, and it shifted something inside him again, reinforcing the understanding that whatever this was, it would not be defined by one gesture, it would be built, slowly, deliberately, if it was built at all, and the city around them remained steady, distant cars passing, the low hum of life continuing beyond this small moment. And Adrian finally stepped back slightly, creating space not out of distance, but out of awareness that this was where his presence was no longer needed for now, and Lily watched him do it, her eyes steady, recognizing the difference between leaving and stepping away, and as he turned, not toward the airport, not toward the life he had paused, but simply toward the street ahead, there was no sense of conclusion, only a quiet shift in direction. And before he took more than a few steps, her voice reached him again, softer this time, but carrying clearly in the still air. "Adrian," she said, and he stopped, turning back just enough to meet her gaze once more. "They remember people who come back," she added, not as a request, not as a pressure, just a truth placed gently between them, and Adrian held that for a second, the weight of it settling not as expectation, but as possibility, and then he nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, before continuing into the night, knowing that for the first time in a long time, the next step he would take was not already planned. The night carried on around him as Adrian walked, the sound of his footsteps steady but unhurried, each step taking him farther from the familiar structure he had once relied on and deeper into something he had not yet defined, and for the first time in years, he did not reach for his phone, did not check the time, did not calculate what came next, because something in him understood that this moment was not meant to be managed, it was meant to be felt, and as he moved beneath the dim streetlights, their glow stretching across the pavement in long, quiet lines, Lily's words remained with him, not as pressure, but as a simple truth that refused to fade. "They remember people who come back," and he realized then that memory, for them, was not about names or titles or what someone could offer, it was about presence. About whether someone showed up again when they said they would, and that kind of consistency was not something he could delegate, not something he could buy or arrange, it was something that required him, fully, without substitution, and the realization settled into him with a quiet weight that felt both unfamiliar and necessary, because in his world, reliability had always been measured in results, in contracts fulfilled, in numbers achieved, but here, it was measured in something far simpler and far more demanding, time given without expectation of return. And as he reached the end of the block, he slowed slightly, his gaze lifting toward the skyline in the distance, the faint outline of buildings rising against the darkened sky, reminders of the life he had built, the one that still existed, still waited for him. Unchanged by the choices he had made tonight, and yet he knew that he was not unchanged, not entirely, because something had shifted, something subtle but irreversible, like a perspective he could not unsee, and without thinking, his hand moved toward his coat pocket again, but this time there was no boarding pass, no immediate obligation waiting to pull him back, only the quiet absence of what he had chosen to leave behind, and he let his hand fall back to his side, the gesture small but symbolic in a way that carried more meaning than he would have recognized before, and somewhere behind him, beyond the corner he had just turned, Lily remained where she was needed, her world continuing without pause, without acknowledgement of the shift she had created simply by being who she was. And Adrian understood now that what had drawn him there was not coincidence, it was contrast, a reflection of something he had not realized he had been missing, something that could not be replaced by success or status or control. And as the night deepened, the city growing quieter with each passing minute, Adrian came to a stop beneath a single streetlight, its glow steady above him, and for a moment he stood there, not lost, not uncertain, just still, allowing the weight of the day to settle into something clearer, something more defined. And when he finally moved again, turning back in the direction he had come from, it was not impulsive, not driven by emotion alone, but by something steadier, something that had begun to take shape in the space between intention and action, because for the first time, he understood that returning was not about repeating a moment, it was about continuing something that had already begun. And as his steps carried him once more toward the corner where the shelter stood, the distance no longer felt like something to measure, it felt like something to cross, not once, but again and again, until presence itself became the answer. The light above the shelter door still glowed softly when Adrian returned, the same quiet halo cutting through the darkness as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had, because this time he did not arrive as a passerby or an observer, he arrived with intention, his step steady, his presence no longer uncertain, and when he reached the door, he did not hesitate, he simply opened it and stepped inside, the warmth greeting him again, familiar now, not because it had changed, but because he had. And down the narrow hallway, he could see the children already settling in, some sitting on worn couches, others curled up with thin blankets, their voices softer now, the energy of the night gently fading into rest, and among them, Lily moved quietly, adjusting a blanket here, offering a quiet word there, her attention never divided. Her presence constant in a way that did not demand recognition, and when she noticed him, she paused for just a moment, her eyes meeting his with that same steady calm, but this time there was no question there, no need to measure or assess, only a quiet understanding that he had chosen to come back, not later, not someday, but now. And Adrian walked toward her without rushing, stopping just a few feet away, the space between them no longer unfamiliar, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Because nothing needed to be explained, the answer had already been given in action, and Lily gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but enough, and she turned slightly, guiding him into the rhythm of the space without ceremony, as if he had always been part of it, and Adrian followed, not leading, not directing, just present. And as he knelt beside one of the children who was struggling to fold a blanket, offering a quiet hand without taking over, he realized that this was what staying meant, not grand gestures, not solutions delivered from a distance, but small, consistent acts that built something steady over time. And the hours passed without urgency, the shelter settling into silence, the soft hum of lights, the occasional whisper, the kind of quiet that carried rest rather than emptiness. And when the last child had fallen asleep, Lily stepped back slightly, her gaze moving across the room, ensuring everything was as it needed to be, and Adrian stood beside her, his eyes following the same path, seeing not just the space, but the lives within it, and for the first time, he did not see a problem to solve, he saw something to stand beside. And Lily spoke then, her voice low so as not to disturb the stillness. "They will remember tonight," she said, and Adrian nodded, understanding that memory was not about the food, or the place, or even him, it was about the feeling of being seen, of being cared for without condition, and he glanced at her, the quiet strength in her presence clearer now than ever, and he answered not with a promise, but with something steadier, "So will I." And Lily's expression softened just slightly, not with relief, not with expectation, but with something deeper, recognition, because she understood the difference between words and presence. And as they stood there in the gentle silence, the city continuing beyond the walls, Adrian realized that everything he had built before had given him power, but this moment, this choice, gave him purpose. And it did not demand anything loud or immediate, it simply asked that he return again, and again, and again, until presence itself became part of who he was. And as the camera of the night seemed to pull back, leaving them there in that quiet room, two lives intersecting not through circumstance but through choice, the truth settled softly into place. Some people spend their lives chasing meaning, and some find it in a single moment they decide not to walk away from. And if this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that even the smallest act of kindness can change the direction of a life, then maybe take a moment to share what you felt, or stay with stories like this by following along, because sometimes, the world changes not through grand events, but through the quiet decisions we choose to repeat.